In the end, the success of our ideals comes down to us, including the example of our own lives, our own societies. We know that there will always be intolerance, but instead of fearing the immigrant, we can welcome him. We can insist on policies that benefit the many, not just the few.
That was President Obama in Belgium on Wednesday, making the claim that embracing immigrants is a mark of our democratic values. But here in the United States, immigrants facing the detention and possible deportation of their loved ones are asking the president to back up that claim. On Monday, protesters in Alabama chained themselves across the entrance of the Etowah County Detention Center, calling for an end to deportations and to protest conditions inside that facility. It's a facility that a report by the Detention Watch Network called among the worst in the country and inconsistent with basic human rights standards. And this protest is not an isolated incident. The same day in Tacoma, Washington, dozens of detained immigrants at the Northwest Detention Center renewed a hunger strike from earlier this month, protesting deportations and conditions in the facility. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Silky Shah, the interim executive director of Detention Watch Network, an organization that advocates for change in the U.S. immigration detention and deportation systems. Nice to have you this morning.
It's great to be here with you.
So, Ms. Shah, we tend to focus on the actual act of deportation. That tends to be the thing that we discuss when we're talking about immigration reform. Tell me why it's important for us to be looking at policies around immigration detention.
Well, detention essentially makes deportation easier. I think that's an important thing to note. So our deportation policies being driven by the fact that we need to fill detention beds. And one perfect example of this is the detention bed quota that requires 34,000 immigrants be detained daily. So if you need to detain immigrants, you need to find people to deport.
So we have a quota that requires that a certain number of these beds be filled?
We do. In the appropriations language, there's actually language that says we shall maintain no less than 34,000 beds. And so that's a major concern for us. And we really need to eliminate the quota to say, OK, some of the most egregious detention centers, like the Etowah County Detention Center, really needs to shut down, and if we eliminate the quota, can that open up space for us to shut it down?
So those kinds of quotas sometimes also exist in our domestic prison practices as well, and they tend to be related to the economic interests of subcontractors, private industry who is actually running these centers. My understanding is that we are similarly subcontracting on these detention centers for immigrants. Would we be in a better situation if ICE ran it directly rather than subcontracting to private organizations?
That's a tough question. I mean, most of the 250 facilities that are used for immigration detention, I think only about 6 are actually operated by ICE. They're not necessarily that much better, but about 50% of beds are actually operated by private prison companies. And then a lot of facilities like Etowah are run by county jails, and none of these facilities have oversight. So that's a big concern. There's no codified standards for how detention is run. And so facilities like Etowah, the conditions consist of human rights abuses such as, nobody ever gets to go outside. There's no outdoor recreation. People spend months or even years in this facility and never go outside. And so for us, I think, we really need to question, why are we putting people in detention when they're really there just to determine their status, to show up to a hearing, to be in compliance with immigration, and not serving a sentence.
So this is important, and it's part of why we wanted to talk to you in the context of this kind of global conversation about kind of the moral authority of the U.S. in talking about issues of human rights and rule of law. I heard you say basically that what we are doing in the context of the detention of people for status offenses, not crimes, but status offenses, may in fact rise to the level of human rights violations?
Absolutely. I mean, under the Universal Declaration, people should be free from arbitrary arrest, detention, and deportation. This is absolutely arbitrary. Mandatory detention policy that expanded in 1996 said, there is no due process. A judge can't say whether somebody should be detained, whether, they're the chief breadwinner of their family. They can't consider any factors. And because of certain crimes, they're mandatorily detained. There is no due process. So that flies in the face of human rights law.
So to what extent, then, does that undermine the capacity of the First Lady, of the President, of any American to make claims on the rest of the world in our diplomacy, in our conversations about the human rights abuses of other states?
I think it absolutely undermines it, but I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is that the U.S. is the world's leading incarcerator, and it's the world's the detention infrastructure is the largest in the world. And I think we need to keep in mind that a lot of this is driven by the fact that the U.S. uses prisons in this model and is incarcerating at a rate that's completely not sound policy. I mean, over 2 million people in prisons around the country, and so they're using this policy, and it doesn't make sense. This is not what's happening in the international context, so it absolutely undermines it.
So let me ask you one last thing. I want to listen for a moment to Speaker Boehner talking about the possibility of comprehensive immigration reform back in February.
Listen, there's widespread doubt about whether this administration can be trusted to enforce our laws. And it's going to be difficult to move any immigration legislation until that changes.
So there's the Speaker of the House saying that comprehensive immigration reform is pretty unlikely to happen anytime soon. What are the immediate remedies that can happen that could impact this question of detention?
Well, first and foremost, we need to eliminate the quota from appropriations language. That definitely needs to happen. That will open up space to close down facilities like Etowah, deal with the issues at Tacoma, and really stop holding people in the most egregious facilities. Secondly, there's been precedent set in the Ninth Circuit that says anybody that's held longer than 6 months should require a bond hearing, and that should happen at the national level under a case called Rodriguez. And I think, Etowah is a perfect example of people who are there are held in prolonged detention. Months, years in detention, and there should be a rule that says after 6 months. I mean, this is something that's very easy to implement and is already happening in the Ninth Circuit. So I think we should move towards that and say, people deserve bond hearings, but ultimately Etowah really needs to shut down.
Thanks to Silky Shah in Washington, D.C.